Ads schmads. If you don't want ads, that's okay. Choose the Dave McWilliams Plus option on Apple Podcasts. And hey presto, no ads.
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? Hope all is well and you're enjoying the Christmas. We have a very special conversation for you now, which is a conversation I had during the year with Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein, probably known to you as very brilliant political activist from the left-hand side of the camp, Canadian, has written probably one of the most formative books written, certainly when I was a young fellow, it was called No Logo. We have a bizarre interview copy of me and Naomi Klein when we looked like two children back from the late 1990s, John, it was actually.
Yeah.
But I sat down with her at the RDS on her new book, Doppelganger, an excellent book. We had a fantastic conversation, went around the houses, very wide-ranging, and I think you'll really enjoy it. So sit back, chill out, and listen to myself and Naomi Klein having the bants in the RDS from last September.
While you're eating your mince pies.
While you're eating your mince pies, exactly.
In my defense, it was never my intent to write this book. I did not have time, no one asked me to, and several people strongly cautioned against it. Not now, not with the literal and figurative fires roiling our planet, and certainly not about this. Other Naomi. That is how I refer to her now, this person with whom I have been chronically confused for over a decade, my doppelganger. A person whom so many others appear to find indistinguishable from me. A person who does many extreme things that cause strangers to chastise me, or thank me, or express their pity for me. The very fact that I refer to her with any kind of code speaks to the absurdity of my situation. For a quarter of a century, I have been a person who writes about corporate power and its ravages. I sneak into abusive factories in faraway countries and across borders to military occupations. I report in the aftermath of oil spills and Category 5 hurricanes. I write books of big ideas about serious subjects, and yet, in the months and years during which this text came into being, a time when cemeteries ran out of space and billionaires blasted themselves into outer space, everything else that I had to write or might have written appeared only as an unwanted intrusion, a rude interruption. In June 2021, as this project began to truly spiral out of my control, a strange new weather event called a heat dome descended on the southern coast of British Columbia, the part of Canada where I now live with my family. The thick air felt like a snarling, invasive entity with malevolent intent. More than 600 people died, most of them elderly. An estimated 10 billion marine creatures were cooked alive on our shores. An entire town went up in flames. Now, it's rare for this out-of-the-way, sparsely populated spot to make international headlines, but the heat dome made us briefly famous. An editor in New York called and asked if I, as someone engaged in the climate fight for 15 years, would file a report about what it was like to live through this unprecedented climate event. I'm working on something else, I told him, the stench of death filling my nostrils. Can I ask what? You cannot. There were plenty of other important things that I neglected during this time of feverish subterfuge. That summer, I allowed my 9-year-old to spend so many hours watching a gory nature series called Animal Fight Club that he began to ram me at my desk like a great white shark. I engaged in all of this neglect so that I could, what? Check her serially suspended Twitter account, study her appearances on Steve Bannon's live streams for insights into their electric chemistry, read or listen to yet another of her warnings that basic health measures were actually a covert plot orchestrated by the Chinese Communist Party, Bill Gates, Anthony Fauci, and the World Economic Forum to sow mass death on such a scale it could only be the work of the devil himself. My deepest shame rests with the unspeakable number of podcasts I mainlined, the sheer volume of hours I will never get back, a master's degree worth of hours. One night, I whimpered into my best friend's voicemail that I feel closer to the hosts of Conspirituality than I do to you. I told myself I had no choice, that this was not, in fact, an epically frivolous and narcissistic waste of my compressed writing time or of the compressed time on the clock of our fast-warming planet. I rationalized that other Naomi, as one of the most effective creators and disseminators of misinformation and disinformation about many of our most urgent crises, and as someone who has seemingly inspired large numbers to take to the streets in rebellion against an almost wholly hallucinated tyranny, is at the nexus of several forces that, while ridiculous in the extreme, are nonetheless important, since the confusion they sow and the oxygen they absorb increasingly stand in the way of pretty much anything helpful or healthful that we humans might decide at some point to do together. Thank you.
Listening to you there, I mean, bizarrely, you and I first did an interview many, many years ago, looking ridiculously young on TV, the pair of us. But I've been, watching your career, reading your stuff, watching your documentaries, reading the books, following your activism. I did not expect this book at all. Explain to me, you were talking about there at the beginning, but the genesis of the book, you in COVID, the doppelganger, the whole framing.
Yeah. So, this book came out of a feeling of speechlessness. It came out of feeling like I couldn't write another typical Naomi Klein book. I was feeling, frankly, depressed politically. And for me, writing and mental health are very tied. So when I found that I just didn't want to write anything at a certain point, I was kind of panicked. And it had to do with a variety of it had less to do with COVID and isolation and more to do with that moment when I think a lot of us realized that COVID was not going to be the kind of wake-up call that maybe we hoped that it would be in the early days. In the first, I'd say 8 months of COVID, I was really involved in all kinds of political organizing. We made a short film with Molly Crabapple, Message from the Future to the Years of Care and Repair, and it was really trying to envision a way that we might learn the lessons of that the virus brought to us so brutally in terms of who was treated as sacrificial, though called essential, the way COVID lit up our connections with one another, challenged the myth of individualism, and but even things like how much we valued time in nature, how much we kind of valued time with each other, didn't miss shopping. And, you remember those days, right? When we were thinking, maybe we'll change. Maybe we won't just rebound to the crisis called normal. Passing around an article by Arundhati Roy, The Pandemic is a Portal, thinking about what we might bring with us. And so, a lot of that hope was also bound up in the racial justice uprisings of that first COVID spring and summer, and the fact that these were the largest protests in American history. And it was just extraordinary. I was still living in the States at the time.
You were living in New Jersey.
I was living in New Jersey, and it was like, it was a kind of quiet neighborhood, and nobody had been on the streets except for going for like those daily walks, right? And then all of a sudden, the streets were full of everybody, and they were showing up for their Black neighbors and for our Black neighbors, and it was like the opposite of every zombie movie plot, where, the apocalypse hits and people come out of their homes to eat each other's brains, except for there was an apocalypse and we were coming out of our homes to just be in solidarity with each other, and try to kind of excavate the true stories of our nation's past. And so I was part of all these kind of projects that were thinking, well, how do we internalize these lessons? How do we come out of this in a way that brings us a Green New Deal and racial justice and economic justice and a green economy? And then it just became clear that that was not going to happen for a variety of reasons. And so that left me feeling profoundly depressed. So that's, now we're entering into 2021. And so I decided to go back to school and get a writing teacher, because I thought, because I thought if I can't get excited about form again, if I can't get excited about content, if I can't be the cheerleader and say, we're really going to do it this time, maybe I can get excited about form, and kind of remember
style
and why I wanted to be a writer in the first place. So I started working with a creative writing teacher, did all these exercises, and just all kinds of different forms, short story, all kinds of things.
But there's also a hell of a lot of literature in here, and there's a lot of references.
We were reading all kinds of. I mean, that's the thing about writing. A writing class is it's mostly about reading other writers. But while this was happening, I would go online and I would constantly get confused with Naomi Wolf, my doppelganger, and
who we will talk about.
And it was kind of surreal because I would go online for some sort of simulation of the friends and community and political movements that I missed. And instead, I would just get inundated with all of these identity confusion events. And then it struck me that that was a really interesting literary device to get into the kind of uncanniness of the whole COVID period. Because, of course, there's nothing more uncanny than having a doppelganger and sort of losing control over your identity. It's why it's such a through line through literature. And so, the book is not about her, but it does use her. She is the white rabbit leading me down the rabbit hole into conspiracy culture. And then we do some mapping to try to figure out what the hell is going on with all the weirdness. Well,
the weirdness, there's no absence of weirdness in the book. There's no absence of weirdness. But I want to bring you back to that COVID period.
Yeah.
And what was going on, you think, in people's heads, because I don't think I'm alone or anyone in the room. I have a lot of friends, even maybe some family, close people who during this period began to go down rabbit holes, began to entertain ideas that there was nothing in their previous behavior that suggested they were going this way.
Yeah.
Before we get into what do you think was going on in people's lives? You've written quite extensively about this in the book, about COVID and what it did to people.
Yeah. I don't think there's one answer for what drove people to these changes. And this is the thing about Wolf, just to back up a bit. So she, those of you who are not familiar with who this person is that we're referring to, she was a very prominent feminist. She came to sort of international renown with her first book called The Beauty Myth that came out at the beginning of the 90s. She was really the most kind of visible face of what was called third wave feminism. Not radical feminism, a very kind of mainstream sort of Sheryl Sandberg-ish kind of feminism. But it had a big impact. And she also was an advisor to Al Gore and very much in the sort of political consultant scene for the party, for the Democratic Party. And now she has become a kind of doppelganger of herself. So she now is on Steve Bannon's show almost daily. Sometimes she is also, was a regular on Tucker Carlson's show when he still had one. She takes pictures of her gun, talks a lot about guns, talks a lot about civil war on the border, things like that. So it's pretty shocking for somebody that prominent of a feminist and liberal to be this kind of crossover star on the far right. And she's not the only one. There are quite, there's not a lot, but there's a significant group of people who have made this migration during the COVID years. And then there's lots of, there I'm talking about prominent people, right?
Yeah.
Like people who we might have heard of. And I'm sure you're making a list in your minds. But then there's also like the uncle, the brother, the yoga teacher who's suddenly talking QAnon. And since this book's come out, I've had so many of these conversations
with yoga teachers.
But
there is a great yoga teacher moment where you're campaigning for your husband. We'll talk about that in a second.
Yes.
And you're like, really? So we'll talk about yoga teachers in a second.
No. So what is the motivation? So I think there's different motivations depending on whether we're talking about a real influencer in this world, like somebody who is monetizing the attention that they're getting by moving over to these platforms. And I think that those motivations are very particular. But then there's all the people who are following them. Yeah. And that is, I think, a more troubling question and more complicated question of like, why is it that so many people are believing these ideas that are not founded in fact, but they're capturing a feeling that is very understandable and very recognizable to me about suspicion of elite power. They have a very, very strong sense that elites are making out like bandits, are keeping
which
things,
would not be wrong,
which is true. And so I say in the book that they often get the facts wrong, but the feelings right.
Yeah, which is a great expression because it's actually what we're talking about. It's a notion or a feeling or a sense. Now, can I just talk to you a bit about, when you and I first spoke, it was about 22 years ago. And when I look at that now, I found it and I put it up on Twitter because I found it somewhere. And when I look at that discussion, it's before smartphones, it's before Twitter, it's before Facebook, it's before social media. It's almost like ancient history. You know what I mean? Like the two of us were there talking away. I was interviewing about No Logo, but the mechanism and the platforms that we were talking on was official television, of which there were 2 stations or 3 stations here.
Yeah.
Let's tease that out, the notion that this thing in our pockets has changed the world.
Yeah. I will come back to that, but the other thing that I think is significant, though, that
fair enough. I thought it was a great question.
No, but what we were talking about, right?
Yeah.
We were talking about these movements that were exploding in the early 2000s. You were asking me about Bono, and there were all these huge, there were protesters outside, large numbers of left-wing young protesters outside of meetings of the G8, outside of the World Bank, outside of the IMF, the World Trade Organization, with an anti-corporate, anti-capitalist, I would argue, systemic critique. And this is the kind of doppelganger that I am most concerned about, not the individual doppelgangers, but the way in which the far right is taking elements of that critique and creating a kind of warped mirror doppelganger of what that left used to be. And, if you look at a figure like Giorgia Meloni, for instance, in Italy, she mixes and matches a, critique of globalism, international banks, code word for Jews, but a feeling that, you don't want to just be a consumer slave, to use her words. And then she flips it, and it's about, it's about the immigrants, it's about trans people, it's about I am a woman, I am Italian, I'm a Christian. But she's absorbing that critique. And for me, as somebody who's been part of those movements my whole life, is, well, where are we on those issues? Like, why are these issues available to be picked up to them? Now, the smartphone may be part of it. I don't know, but certainly that was a big part of the reason why I wanted to write the book, was that I wanted to come back to what this technology has unleashed and enabled in terms of our ability to create doubles and doppelgangers of ourselves, right? Like, who are we when we make an avatar of ourselves and online, and that represents us to the world? Is that us, or is that a commodity version of us? And are we confused about that for ourselves, but also for each other? Like if I see your avatar, do I think that is a human? Or am I sure that is a human?
Are you sure? Yeah, are you sure? Yeah.
I think part of the reason why there's so much cruelty online is I think we're not quite sure each other are human when we're performing branded versions of ourselves. Yeah.
Are the thing we'd like to project to people.
And then you add AI, and then we're genuinely unsure.
Well, that's where we're going. That's a different.
Exactly.
But actually, let's go back to that point, because you're absolutely right. Like 20 years ago, the let's say, big pharma. Okay, that was an issue of the left.
Yes.
Absolutely an issue of the left.
It was the center of
it. So,
it was repealing the WTO's intellectual property rights on AIDS medications.
What do you think has happened over the last, let's say, 5 or 10 years, so that message, which is a very galvanizing message, and it's a very simple message to understand, and it's a very clear message, has been taken by the far right as one of their... I'm just giving that as one example. What do you think has happened to the left and to the society?
So this is what I'm trying to figure out, like what happened to that critique, because in the early, this is why I really want to resist the sort of one-to-one equation that it's the same. It has changed, right? The movements that we're talking about were pretty wonky. They read the trade agreements, and they understood that there were rules within the world, these obscure trade agreements that were preventing generic drugs from reaching people whose lives could be saved by them. And there was incredible activism, much of it coming from the global South, that was calling for, a repeal of TRIPS, is the part of the World Trade Organization agreement that deals with intellectual property rights. So it was not just a wail against big pharma. Like it had demands that, I think would materially save lives. And in some cases, exceptions were won and generics were able to reach people. And a lot of lives actually were saved because of some really heroic activism, particularly like the Treatment Action Coalition out of South Africa, for instance. Steve Bannon, as a sort of...
Yes. By the way, because of Naomi, I have now, the last week, been watching War Room. Bannon's thing, and it's compulsive. It's compulsive. Let's talk Bannon, because Bannon's a central figure in this whole business.
Sure.
And also because the business is extremely serious. We're kind of being a bit flippant, but this is the emerging political movement of our age.
It is.
And we have to take it very seriously.
And there's... It may have taken a little bit longer to come to Ireland than it did to other countries, but it is global, and you start seeing these very, very similar echoes. Like when I was watching some footage from what happened outside the Dáil last week, very recognizable to me from all of this research. Very similar slogans. It's described as incoherent. I think there's some identifiable threads and ideologies that if we look closely, we can see them about sort of superior bodies and beings and a hierarchy of life that runs through, appeals to the natural, a kind of toxic nostalgia for the family, for the nation. And we've been dealing with this in Canada. We've been seeing it in New Zealand with the Truckers' Convoy. It's global because they're listening to the same shows. And one of the shows they're listening to is Steve Bannon's War Room. And it's important to understand that he is not just a U.S. political figure. When he left the White House or was kicked out of the White House, he immediately set out to build what he calls, a populist international, or some people might call like an international fascist alliance. And he is weaving together far-right parties from around the world. When Giorgia Meloni came to power in Italy, he was like a proud papa. She's one of his early members of the coalition, her party, Fratelli d'Italia. So the thing to understand about Bannon is he is a political strategist who is very, very serious about power. And his skill as a strategist is identifying the issues that his opponents have left unattended. And that people really do care about. So in 2016, a big part of the way he got Trump into the White House was by convincing Trump to start talking about free trade deals, the very trade deals that we were protesting.
Exactly.
And precisely because the Democratic Party had promised and broken its promise again and again to address these trade deals. And so then along comes Trump and he says, I'm going to be the guy who's going to renegotiate them. So he is now doing that with a whole host of other issues, and he's harnessing the very real and legitimate rage at big pharma that is not just about the vaccines, that is also about the opioid epidemic, is also about drug prices, is also just about a feeling that a medical industry is more interested in selling you drugs than actually keeping you healthy and all of that.
Yeah.
But he is not, he has no solutions for that. It just immediately pivots. I mean, the only solution is just don't get vaccinated, but there isn't actually a policy solution he's engaging in. He has no interest in challenging the intellectual property, provisions. He has no plans for taking on big tech. He just wants to start his own tech platforms and compete with them.
But he's what he's doing, and I remember, we had Bernie Sanders, not here, but down the road a couple of years back. And I want to talk to you about Bernie's campaign as well. But, Bernie was making the point that the left behinds used to be his people. They were Bernie's people. They're the people at the left. He says now the left behinds, the people for whom globalization, the people for whom automation, the people who find it very difficult to make a living and have a stake and have a say and get heard, they're gravitating naturally towards the likes of Bannon. And this is why the movement
But Bannon did not want to run Trump against Bernie. He says that very openly.
Was he scared? He was scared of Bernie?
Yeah, because Trump is a counterfeit populist. I mean, look at him. And all these multimillionaires and billionaires. I mean, Rupert Murdoch railing against the elites, right? Did you see that
last week?
Steve Bannon. Or did you see Elon Musk in his cowboy hat at the border?
No, I didn't. I actually spared myself.
I think he went yesterday. When these fake populists. Who are really just using conspiracy as a kind of distraction machine to keep attention away from them, to keep the attention away from the systems that allowed them to become as rich as they are. Of course, they want people chasing their tails and conspiracies and not actually looking at the systems. But if you actually have somebody who is running on a platform of universal health care and raising, the minimum wage to be a living wage and actually taking on big pharma and lowering drug prices, which was what Bernie talks about, it's kryptonite for them. It reveals them to be the frauds that they are. So Bannon wants nothing to do with Bernie. It's actually why I'm sure maybe you've seen. Maybe you're not following U.S. politics this closely, and God bless you if you're not. But
there are some real obsessives in this country about U.S. politics.
There's been this little war over the last couple of days between Trump and Biden about who's more pro-auto workers union. Have you seen some of this? But that is because the leader of the auto workers union is a Bernie-type figure. His name is Sean Payne. I'm probably Irish. I mean,
yeah. The only problem is so is Bannon.
He's fantastic.
We never own Bannon, but he is.
Well, listen. This is one of the most fiery labor leader the U.S. labor movement has had in many decades. He ran as an insurgent candidate to be the leader of the most powerful private sector union and won against the incumbent. And he is out there in the news now.
And they're fighting over him.
Doing real left economic populism, and they all just want to get next to him. Yeah. So that says something, I think, about how you fight this stuff.
No, absolutely. You go back to the core issues, the issues that mean... Now, you say in the book that you were trying to figure out what was this overarching, almost political tent into which all these various people, the yoga teachers, the soccer moms, the really crazy right, the religious right, all that sort of stuff. And you come up with this expression, diagonalism. Explain that to me, because I'd never heard that before.
So diagonalism is not my term. It's a term that was coined by a couple of scholars of European politics, William Callison and Quinn Slobodian. They studied what was going on in Germany during Germany had big anti-lockdown protests early on. And the German word roughly translates as diagonal thinking or outside the box thinking. I think it's Querdenken. I'm mispronouncing it. But it is the way they define diagonalism is the mix and match of extreme suspicion of any establishment institutions, a belief that all power is conspiracy, elements of holism and appeals to the natural in the New Age, entrepreneurialism. They talk about I think the phrase is that it's a monetizable
Right.
disaster. And they say that though it has these elements of the sort of greenish New Age left that do sometimes cross over in this diagonal line, it reliably arcs to the right.
Right.
And that's a very important point, that it's not like sometimes it goes left and sometimes it goes right. I'm still waiting for anyone to come up with a single example of it going left. It seems to go very reliably, as maybe starting with some left-ish concerns, but it seems to always end in anti-immigration, transphobia, banning books about the true history of our nations, and yeah.
I mean, it's funny when you're talking there. I'm thinking. I mean, I know he's in the news at the moment. It's kind of Russell Brand territory. You know that idea of entrepreneurialism against the big state, against vaccines, but also very much into physical health and all that sort of stuff. So these characters have emerged enabled by smartphones and communications, but they're tapping into something that isn't going away.
Well, I think they're tapping into, yeah. I think they're tapping into a couple of things. One we've talked about already, which is that this system isn't working for most people. And we don't do real economic education, and we don't, in North America, don't teach people about capitalism in high school, except to tell them it's about like sunshine and rainbows and Big Macs and the meritocracy. And so then when you can't afford your grocery bills, even though you're working 3 jobs, and you can't afford rent, and you're never gonna own a house, and all the promises are breaking, you're very vulnerable to somebody who says, oh, it's all Bill Gates and Fauci and Klaus Schwab, and if we could just bring them up on war crimes trials, that everything would be fine and we'd have great capitalism again, right? Because and that is why, even though it adopts the language of anti-quote-unquote elitism, it is very much an elite project.
Yes.
It's a system-protecting project. It's about restoring some, benevolent capitalism, nation-state, family, which is, I was referring to as toxic nostalgia. But what I'm saying, I think a couple things is going on. I also think that when you're talking about a figure like Brand, he also is tapping into a desire for a more holistic worldview, a coming together of, it's sort of head and heart. I think people feel a severing that is real. I feel it. I feel like most left politics doesn't really know how to speak to the sort of spiritual core of what is being lost in the climate crisis, for instance, or of a need for something larger than oneself. These are guru figures. This is, I think, what's important. Yeah. It's not just the technology. It's that these are people who very much want to not be a political leader, but be a guru. They want to occupy that space. And that's, alarm bells, I think, should go off immediately whenever anybody wants to be your guru.
I think that's a general rule. That's absolutely. Yeah. Let's go back to the other Naomi for a second. She is very useful to this movement. Mm-hmm. And is her very conversion the act that's very useful? So that the more people who were on the liberal left or on the liberal side, I mean, you're talking to somebody who, Germaine Greer said, The Beauty Myth was one of the most important books of feminism since the Second World War. I mean,
She actually said since my book.
Oh, well, there you go. There you go.
Since
there you
Germaine
go.
Greer's book.
Okay. Did she say that?
Yes, she did.
Well, you can't take that against her because the female eunuch was pretty good. But I'm going back to this idea of people being co-opted. This idea that the useful idiot. They're very useful for a movement. Do you think that's where Naomi Wolf's currency is?
Yeah, I think there's two roles that she's playing. One is, and she is very useful, and I have a section in the book about what she's getting out of this alliance and what they are getting out of her.
Yeah.
And I think what she's getting out of it is not that interesting. She was sort of discredited from her 2019 book. People might remember she did this catastrophic interview on BBC where it was found that she had made these foundational errors in a book. It was like every writer's worst nightmare. The book got pulped. She wasn't going to be getting another book contract from a mainstream publisher. And so I think that was a personal disaster for her.
Yeah.
And it was horrible to watch. It was horrible to watch all the kind of mockery that followed. I should know because a lot of people think I made those foundational errors.
So you got it.
BBC, so I literally have a lot of empathy. But so I think she's getting everything she had and more. There's something of a sense in sort of polite liberal circles when somebody is no longer in the pages of the newspapers that we read or even on our social like network platforms, that they no longer exist on planet Earth. And she actually has a much larger platform than she's had at any point since the 90s with Bannon and Carlson and these parallel mirror world platforms that she's very good on, including Getter and I think Rumble. So what are they getting out of her is what you're asking. And I think this claim around diagonalism, right? The centerpiece of it is that it's a new politics, right? That this is not the old Republican Party. It is not the old fascist, Mussolini party. There is something new and special and progressive and post-partisan going on. And that's why it is very important to have a few of these people who I call crossover stars, because they are the ones who make it look like something new, right? If it weren't for the Wolfs and the Brands and, fill in your blanks, then it would just be the same old MAGA proposition. So it matters. It matters that there were yoga sessions at the trucker convoy in Ottawa.
Were there?
Yeah, sure.
That's quite.
Yeah. So I don't know if there was any of that at the gallows.
Outside the Dáil, I didn't see yoga mats now last Tuesday night outside the Dáil.
Don't be surprised; they'll be there next time. They'll be like Kundalini gallows.
I love it. I love the image. Downward dog and the thing. Anyway.
But the other thing is actually more tangible than that, which is I think she represents a portion of women voters who had not gone this route in previous elections. A lot of men went sort of MAGA right in the U.S., but this is not just a U.S. thing. This is true for a lot of conservative parties. They have trouble with women voters. The men tend to be more conservative than women. And somebody like Bannon, who is a real strategist, understands that there were some angry women during COVID, angry about school closures, angry about masks, vaccines. He calls them the warrior moms. And he says that Wolf was top of his list for Woman of the Year because all these moms listened to her. This is a quote. So I sort of said that she's a little bit like the kind of like Karen in chief for Bannon. Like she wants to speak to the manager on everyone's behalf about all the things. But that also I think relates to some of what is driving this. Like I think this is a disproportionately white movement, and and white women are very involved in leading it. And I think part of it has to do with the sense from some women who, were part of the third wave and second wave of feminism, who are unsure of whether or not they have a place in the new politics. And there's this kind of wild co-optation that goes on of like claiming that vaccines and mask mandates are like apartheid, they're like Jim Crow, they're like slavery, they're like genocide. It's like, what else are they like? They're like all the crime, they're the Holocaust.
They pulled out Nazism too.
Sure.
Of course they pulled out Nazism.
Of course they wear the yellow stars and, and it's just this like really over the top kind of appropriation and cosplaying. And it's clear that there's something going on. That section of the book is called I Too Am a Victim, the Biggest Victim. So it's worth unpacking because then the flip is you appropriate the slogans of a racial justice movement. So like, they'll say, like there are signs that say, I can't breathe about a mask, which is, just a few months after people are shouting, I can't breathe in the streets about the murder of George Floyd. But then they're also electing politicians who are banning books about civil rights history and making it illegal in Florida to teach, about the truth of racial oppression in the United States. So it's a double move. It's appropriation and also an attempt to actually kind of stamp out the original. It's something we need to understand, I think, about and I think the other thing is, it's funny to talk about the appropriations in some ways because they're so over the top, but they're part of an apocalyptic language, an apocalyptic discourse.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why it's, I think, really important to distinguish between what some of the leaders may or may not think, we have no idea, and what the people who are listening to them believe. And I think they believe them. And this is where it tips into political violence again and again. And, whether it's the January 6th storming of the Capitol, which was, based on a conspiracy that the election had been stolen. It was not stolen, but people believed that false claim. And that's just one example of the way these conspiracies, like all these men who are going into grocery stores and schools and talking about the great replacement theory, right? White men with guns who believe that they are being replaced that there is a plot to replace white people with immigrants. These theories lead to real world violence.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, because what we're talking about is old-fashioned propaganda. We've seen it before, again and again. Typically, it's centralized in the state or it's centralized in a party, but here it's absolutely disparate. But it's changing people's worldview. I mean, you've said in the book, one of the quote was like, attention is the most valuable commodity in the world right now. And attention is up for grabs. And these guys are grabbing it. And this is where I think the center, the left, wherever you decide to locate yourself, doesn't seem to have quite grasped that it's attention. And that's what Bannon's very good at.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes on the left, we just think, well, we need a better podcast, and
I know that feeling.
I don't think that is going to cut it, because I think the reason why their podcasts can be as sensational as they are and grab the amount of attention that they do is because they're willing to make up facts and they're willing to bring people along on these like Hollywood scripts. And a part of the script is that there's going to be justice, right? The part of the story, that's why they show up with gallows. Like the story is not just that you're against these things, it's that you are going to arrest these people and there's going to be justice. And the QAnon story, it's a great storm. There's white hats and black hats. And it's a big part of the kind of mythology around Trump. Trump is going to come in and he's going to bring in the storm. Yes. But it is not just about, speaking truth to power.
No.
It is a story of retribution and
it's
justice.
Almost kind of biblical. It's like Day of Reckoning sort of stuff.
Very
God
much,
will come and smote you down.
Yeah. And so I think that this is not going to be one just in the realm of words. I think,
Yes.
and that's why I'm saying that somebody like this, like a really fiery labor leader who is on all the television screens because he's actually organizing a disruptive strike, saying, these bosses have enriched themselves wildly, had their most profitable years, and we haven't even kept up with cost of living. Like, it's the combination of speech and action that we have to go for, because I don't think we should sever our ties with recognizable reality and just make things up, right? Or just show up with our own gallows.
White lies.
So I think it's going to be the promise of a real change that will put this sort of fantasy world, hopefully, in some kind of perspective. There will always be people, hucksters, who are trying to sell this. All we can do is take away some of their customers.
Yeah, exactly. But let's focus now. So we're going into this next November, 12 months, is the American election. It's very close. Your man with the big yellow face is miles ahead in the Republican polls. Miles, Let's talk about the next 12 months in politics, in real world politics, against the background of all this noise, the doppelgangers, the propaganda, because there will be any number of issues now over the next couple of months that'll come hard and fast.
Yeah.
What's your sense of the next? I know you're in Vancouver, so you're slightly over the border, right? But what's your sense?
I always think it's a good vantage point to watch American politics from. I did live in the States for a few years, and it was fun while Bernie was running to be able to really throw in for him. But now I like.
I want to come back and talk to you about Bernie in a sec. But the next 12 months.
I think that we're starting to see a return of collective organizing. There's a lot of I think people have been trying to make sense of how you go from these highs of, think about the student climate strikes of 2019, millions of people in the streets around the world. And the Bernie campaign, we thought we were going to win. We really, we won a lot of states, and we sort of had the wind at our backs. And then the sort of closing down of the ranks around Biden coincided precisely with the lockdown. So that was part of what went wrong with the left, I think, is that we were not able to, for good reasons, just actually come together and strategize. And there's only so much you can do in a Zoom call. And then we really needed to get rid of Trump. So people just kind of put their heads down, got Trump out of the White House, and then kind of crashed.
Yeah.
But what I see happening on the American left is trying to figure out how you can win the argument and lose these wars, right? Mm-hmm. And part of it is that the institutions of the left have been very weak. So you have these kind of flash mobs, right, where suddenly you have unprecedented numbers of people on the streets, but there aren't the democratic institutions to support those movements. And so then when there starts to be tension and infighting, they just kind of fall apart because there isn't a way to hold people accountable and maybe change leadership or anything like that. And instead it just turns into recrimination on these platforms. Mm-hmm. So I do see that people are trying to build some sturdier institutions. There's a lot of work going on around tenant organizing, a lot of work going on around debtor organizing, and a lot of really interesting labor organizing, not just the auto workers, but the Starbucks workers and Amazon workers. So I would just say that about Biden, that he does know he needs to have something to offer, which is why he has belatedly been trying to get a few signature policies through, like he just passed a climate corps, which is based on the New Deal era Civilian Conservation Corps. So it's a project to get a lot of young people out in doing green jobs and things like that. And it was one of the tenets of the original Green New Deal idea.
Yeah.
So that's a sort of offer to young people. What we're hoping is that in addition to walking the picket line with the UAW, that he also attaches, he has the power, he has executive authority to attach strings to the unfortunately named IRA, Inflation Reduction Act.
It has struck me all the time. You get talking to Americans, they're talking about the IRA, and I'm about to sing "Ooh, Off the Raft," but you can't sing that anymore.
Well, the IRA
If we got
represents...
Naomi Klein singing that, wouldn't that be a weird way to end the thing? Go for it.
Well, it represents something around more than $300 billion worth of infrastructure investments, much of it green infrastructure. If those jobs had to be union jobs, it would be so significant to the labor movement. And so there's a push now to try to get Biden to do that. That would be a big deal in terms of, it's not about optic. It's not
it's about stuff. It's about getting things done.
Like he can get his picture taken, so can Trump. That's not good enough anymore.
Do you think that the center or the left can beat this incipient movement by playing by the rules?
What do you mean by the rules? I think the left should be disruptive. I don't think we should play by the rules. I think we should be nonviolent. But I think we need to disrupt business as usual. And I think we need mass movements to remember that we are strong. This is what mass demonstrations do. And we demonstrate to one another that we are not alone, that we have this latent power as groups, as class, and so we need more of those moments, and we haven't had very many of them. I don't know if it's different here, but I think I think the isolation of the pandemic is somehow still with us. And a lot of what I talk about in the book is that what we're doing with our brands, with our reflections, with the sort of perfected self, is, we're pitting ourselves against each other.
Yep.
We're trying, I think, in really understandable ways to get an edge in this brutal economy by optimizing, performing, perfecting, and none of it is going to get us where we need to go. We really need to loosen the grips on ourselves and sort of reach towards each other, which was really the joy of the Sanders campaign. It was that, amazing slogan, "Not me, us," and we really felt that on the campaign trail. Not just "Not Bernie, us," which is how it sort of started, but eventually what it really was this kind of, I call it a social justice spell, where so many people are suffering privately, alone, feeling ashamed because they can't pay the bills, because they are carrying this debt, and it feels like this individual shameful crisis. But when you knock on doors and when you come together, in halls and stadiums, that private shame becomes a collective power, because, as a group, as a class, you can refuse to pay, you can demand change, and that's what is starting to be rebuilt. And it's really our only hope. And Biden is somebody who can be pushed. And, we got the best policies out of Biden when there was still more movement that was pushing him. And then when people kind of collapsed into, this, period where there was a lot of fragmentation and recrimination, I think they kind of thought, well, maybe we can get away with doing less, because they're corporate Democrats. They don't really want to do anything.
Yeah.
And now they're getting close to the election.
So they're going to do lots.
And they're like, okay,
let's be all workers and auto workers. Before I go to the floor, over the last 25 years, Naomi, you've always been at the vanguard of discussions and activism about climate change. Mm-hmm. And by the way, the book ends optimistically. The book ends, I think, optimistically. Mm-hmm. You talk about Red Vienna. You talk about all sorts of moments where people came together to change the world, to change their circumstances. You've written extensively about climate change. Do you think one of the big battles now is sort of populism versus net zero? That in the course of the next 5 or 6 years, the climate will become the issue where populists galvanize. So if you listen to Marine Le Pen, so Marine Le Pen is likely to be the next president of France. That we know. It's very, very hard to see anybody beating her at this stage.
Oh my God.
Then you will have Meloni, Le Pen in Italy and France. One of their issues is let's attack climate change because we think this is a weakness.
Right. So, we've talked about the attention economy, and during COVID, the attention economy was supercharged because there's never before been a global synchronous crisis like this when we were all connected, right? So billions of people were able to be part of sort of the same conversation. So that meant that if you had the right combination of messages, you would catch a digital carpet ride, the likes of which have never been seen before. So when you look at something like, the way Russell Brand's follower count increased, the more he, hit those talking points.
Yeah, he ratcheted things up, yeah.
Right, but it was so fast. I mean, from below 1 million to 7 million,
in a number, yeah.
So right now we're in this very dangerous phase where that's money, like that is an economy. There's a whole economy around this, and it's like kind of like a heat-seeking missile right now, where it's just like, where are we going to get the next? Where are we going to get the next lift off? What is going to provide us with the kind of juice that we got? Now, nothing is going to be like COVID because nothing is going to be as globally synchronous as that. But they're looking for it. Ukraine, transphobia. Climate. It seems climate.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They're looking. If you look,
it's not going to be one thing. It's going to be a combination. But absolutely, this idea that the Davos elite is going to use climate to lock you in your homes and make you eat bugs, and you're going to have to live in a 15-minute city, which actually means that you're not allowed to leave your house for more than 15 minutes. I mean, you just make up your own facts, right? But it's,
Actually, the 15-minute city one was a really new one that came in. I was like, where is that coming from?
Yeah,
but it's a real
It's not
one.
going anywhere, yeah. There's also, you are the carbon they want to remove. Have you heard this one? Yeah.
I'm going to say that to my kids. Tonight.
So, I mean, it's important to understand that there are real economic reasons why they're looking for something, and political reasons, because this was a period of very effective political organizing for the right. And then people start to get bored, and there are no more mask and vaccine mandates. So they're like, what are we going to do now? And that's what they're looking for. And that's why they latch on to something like a boring city council debate about parking. And they decide that's tyranny. We have to go stop that. Yeah. So I think I feel like it's, I'm a broken record about climate. I've been saying this for a long time. But if the climate policies that are on offer are elite climate policies that pass on the bill to working people who are now are vastly more overburdened than the last time I said this in Dublin, in 2019, 2014,
2012,
no, but
2001.
This is the vision of a Green New Deal. It is, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said when she first introduced the resolution, we fight poverty and climate change at the same time. It is possible, eminently possible, to design climate policies so that they are redistributive. You can make the subway free. You can pay to insulate people's homes. You can buy the heat pumps for them. Unfortunately, the climate policies that we have tended to get from neoliberal politicians are ones that, if they do not directly pass the costs on to working people while letting billionaire oil companies off the hook entirely, at least can be made to seem so, right? So the fights that are going on in the UK right now over the ultra low emission zones. I mean, there's a lot of distortion going on in the way the right are characterizing them. But the problem is it takes 3 sentences to explain why I can get the scrappage fees and it's not that car, or there's only that car. And they can just be like, they're going to take your car away because you're poor and they're rich, right?
Yeah.
And so if we do not understand that we need to fight inequality, injustice, and climate change at the same time, we will lose again and again and again. And whatever little gains we've won, will be beat back by the forces that I'm describing.
No, because I mean, what's amazing, I've been watching German, the Alternative for Deutschland, and this is right. This is a party that's very radical and very nasty, and it's all about the cost of your boiler. It's exactly this.
Yeah.
The entire thing has come down to how you're who's going to pay for climate change. Just before we go,
But this is, I was saying before, like they have a vision they have a vision of a kind of a justice, right? The great storm, we're going to arrest them. We should really, I think, throw in on Sue Big Oil, getting the oil companies, to pay for the transition. We've got some bad guys. We should go after them. And it's not that, we could bring them up on war crimes trials. I don't think we have to. I think we could just take their money. I'm satisfied with that. But like some real populism,
Ladies and gentlemen, Naomi Klein.